Let's talk about the Southeast Asian Dha. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So we're going to look a little bit at the Dha here. I have looked at Dhas in past videos. I've particularly looked at this antique example I've got here. What is the Dha? It's a relatively short, single-edged, predominantly one-handed sword from Southeast Asia. So these examples are from Thailand, thereabouts, but you also find Dha from places like Vietnam and neighbouring places as well. So across Southeast Asia we will find the Dha. And it is perhaps in the modern world, I would say, most famously found in Thailand. And this example in my right hand here is from a company called Siamese Edge, who very kindly have sent this example to me, a modern made example, to review, which a full review will follow in due course. This isn't a review video, but nevertheless, this is the first look of the Dha from Siamese Edge. Link below, and thanks very much to them for sending this to me. Now, what's interesting is the only Dha, literally, this is only the second Dha I've ever actually owned. I've handled lots of Dhas in my life, but this was the first example I owned, and the example that I have kept, and in fact due to legal changes it's now extremely difficult for me to sell it because this is made of ivory, elephant ivory, and that is part of a tusk. And some of these antique swords you have almost an entire piece of the end of a tusk on there. So because of the percentage of ivory, and this is some kind of dancer or ritualistic figure there with the head bent backwards, perhaps has been executed? I don't know. I'd need someone who knows more about Siamese or Thai history and iconography to explain what that means. But it's got silver fittings along it, and I've spoken about various features of this sword in the past. One of the things I've spoken about was how it's worn. Now I'll just mention that very briefly. If I just stick this over here, it has a really convenient way of wearing, whereby with one loop you can simply loop it under there, and it's in a very convenient location to get out and use very, very quickly. And I absolutely love the simplicity of this wearing method. And sometimes when we're looking at ancient world scabbard wearing, shall we say, there is a parallel here with the so-called baldric, the way that it goes diagonally across. Now, most European sort of ancient world and even medieval world baldrics are longer than this. This is raised up higher. Why might that be? Well, it could be something to do with the environment, it could be something to do with the clothing. There's various other reasons why that might be, but we do find a parallel for this very high way of wearing it up here under the armpit, really, in Sudanese Kaskara and Tuareg Takubas as well. So North African. Above the Sahara, North African sword-wearing, straight sword in that case. So we do find parallels for this type of wearing system. And if we look at this modern-made example, which Siamese Edge have sent to me, it's exactly the same. You stick it on over there, and it's ready to go. And that is actually a really convenient place to wear a sword. I'm actually a big, big fan of it. It's not on your back, although you could probably contrive some kind of way to end up with this on your back if you were in a movie, but for practical real world life, as I've explained in numerous videos, wearing the sword either sort of somewhere at hip height or somewhere up the left hand side, and in the case of the Roman world on the right hand side, is far more common throughout history and across cultures all over the planet than wearing on the back. But nevertheless, so this is a traditional Dha made very much in the same form. I will say it is somewhat bigger, but Dha do vary in size, and we vary in size as well. So the simple fact is that I'm 6'1", so I'm probably slightly on the tallish side compared to an average Southeast Asian person, but certainly if we go back to the 19th century or 18th century or earlier, then I'm certainly taller than an average person in Southeast Asia in the 1800s was. So therefore, for me personally, a slightly bigger sword probably makes sense. And equally for a modern Southeast Asian person compared to someone 200 years ago. So there is a few other interesting features. We'll talk about the sword in a second. I'll put that off camera, so I'll save that. About the scabbard to mention. So it's a wooden scabbard, and they are made in two halves that go together, semicircular halves that go together here. You can see that the aperture or hole for the blade is the same shape as the blade. It's not rectangular or anything like that. So the blade sits very snugly in there. The two halves go together. On traditionally made examples, I suspect because the nature of the glues that were available in that part of the world historically, and the fact that it's a very humid environment, and for durability, they often didn't only rely on glue. Okay, so if we look at Japanese swords, for example, they're often just glued together. However, with Southeast Asian weapons, the Dha and various others, whether it's a Moro, Kris or anything like that, you often find that there are bands that go around parts of the scabbard. And if we look at the historical example here, which is probably 19th century, this actually has silver bands, so it's very, very fancy. The silver's tarnished, incidentally, it needs a bit of a polish up. I try not to polish silver too often because obviously it's to a minor degree slightly abrasive. So these bands are made of very fancy silver that go around, and they hold the two halves together, and underneath the silver is red velvet. It's all very, very fancy. However, a more utilitarian, a typical warrior's version might have rattan, or might have just copper or iron bands going around, but nevertheless holding these two halves together. The other interesting feature of these scabbards is you'll notice that they are very flat, characteristically flat at the end. So whilst they are almost cylindrical, kind of ovoid I would say at this end, they get flatter towards the end down here. Now, I don't know why this is, but what's really, really interesting to me is, as you know, I review a lot of swords by LK Chen on this channel, and I've got more to go, I've got a big pile of them. And looking at historical Chinese swords, swords that come out of graves that are sometimes 2,000 years old or older, they often have this exact same feature. Now, understandably, Southeast Asia has some common technological developments with China, of course, because on a world scale they're not that far away from each other, and obviously there's some genetic relationships going on there as well. But in terms of technology, now what's really interesting to me is I don't see any practical reason why this scabbard, this type of, and this is common to most of them, is cylindrical or ovoid at this end and then flat at this end. But as I say, you find the exact same thing on certain Chinese swords going back thousands of years. So, interesting feature. It could be something to do with weight. It could mean that the end of the scabbard therefore is nice and light and doesn't hit with force, doesn't flap around too much. It's more comfortable to wear, perhaps just more efficient. It's essentially like distal taper on a blade, isn't it? Who knows? Who knows the reasoning? But I find it very interesting that that is a feature with no obvious explanation, and it's a feature we find on Chinese swords going back hundreds of years. Now, let's talk, before we reveal the full sword as well, let's talk a little bit about the hilts. Now, they are long. Something I've spoken about in the past. Again, it's a curiosity of the Dha. There's a few things actually about the hilt. So the first thing to mention is there is no discernible guard. Okay, there's nothing to protect your hand other than you, your movement, which is fine. That's not a criticism. There are lots of swords. I mean, in real terms, the guards on something like a gladius or a Sparta from the Roman era, or certain types of Greek sword, equally Egyptian swords as well, and swords from all over the ancient world, in fact, don't. But most of them, with some exceptions like the Copis and Falcata and the later period Sparta, most of them don't have a handguard which is going to provide an awful lot of hand protection. Most of the time a handguard is to prevent your hand from sliding onto the blade, particularly when thrusting. Now what's interesting is that these don't even have that to a certain degree. I mean, the grip is really cylindrical, and we'll talk more about that in a second, but it just continues straight up the top. There's no tsuba. There's no guard like we'd find on Chinese swords or Japanese swords or Korean swords. It's just completely cylindrical. So if I were to thrust hard into armour with this, there is really nothing to prevent my hand from sliding straight up and potentially coming off the grip and onto the blade. So that might, therefore, we might be able to infer something about the way that these swords were historically used. Yes, they've got a pointy point on the end, but maybe if they were being used to thrust, they were only thrusting against people who weren't really wearing any type of resistant clothing. I do know, obviously, Southeast Asia, the climate being what it is, a lot of time the people fighting didn't necessarily wear anything. They were just there in their, essentially, you know, the basic clothing to protect their modesty, and that was about it. That being said, there was armour in Southeast Asia, and in fact if we look at historical art, we actually see remarkably heavy armour in some cases on certain types of elite soldiers. And if we look at the Philippines, even as late as the early 20th century, the Moros fighting against the Americans, for example, often had extensive armour that was sometimes native made, sometimes locally made, and sometimes imported from places like Persia. So there was armour, but probably not an awful lot of people had it. Maybe, so therefore the fact that there's nothing to stop your hand sliding up, does that mean they just didn't thrust into armour? Does it mean that they didn't thrust? Does it just mean they were essentially just cutting with these swords and they were cutting implements and not things that they thrust very much with? I don't know, okay? I throw that open to, if you know a lot about Southeast Asian martial arts, be it Filipino martial arts or perhaps even Thai or Vietnamese martial arts, Krabi, Krabong, things like that, do they thrust much? I don't know. I've not noticed an awful lot of thrusting. It seems to be mostly cutting centric, and maybe that, I mean, I have to say, looking at Philippine weapons as well, we find a similar feature on things like the barong. The barong doesn't really have anything to stop your hand sliding up in a thrust either. Neither does a kukri, but equally we know kukris were predominantly used to chop with, not to thrust with. So that might be a clue about the method of use. Now the next thing to mention is the cylindrical nature of these grips. Now I have made the argument in the past that a cylindrical grip, for me, is I would rather have an oval grip or even an octagonal grip or a flat grip, something that helps me index the edge and helps me keep the edge aligned, okay? I'm not going to say too much about that point because I've said a lot about it in the past, and I also don't want to dwell too much in this video on that point. But that's something to bear in mind. Now, I've also made the counterpoint that cylindrical grip isn't always bad. Number one, because of asymmetry of the blade. So something like an axe, you can always feel which direction the blade's pointing in because the axe blade projects out from the central axis. With a curved sword, you get similar effect because when you swing the thing, a bit like a weather vane, it tends to want to self-right itself if it's got curve to it. But that being said, Dha have very little curve, and honestly I don't feel any self-righting happening with these, and I personally do find edge alignment a bit of a problem with the Dha. The last thing to, so I'll leave that point there. The last thing to say about the hilt or the grip is the length of it. Now, something that's very notable about the Dha and a characteristic feature of it, they tend not to have terribly long blades. You do get longer ones, but most of them are relatively short and single-edged and slightly curved, or they do also get straight ones with a clipped point as well. But something to note is that relative to the length of the blade, the hilts are usually quite long. And in fact, on this modern example from Siamese Edge, again, check out the link below, you'll notice it says an even longer hilt. Now, why would that be? That's, you know, an archaeologist might look at that and go, oh, a long hilt definitely means these were used two-handed. Is a wakizashi usually used two-handed? No, it's not. It's usually used one-handed, but they equally have a slightly longer grip. So there is a tradition in Asia, particularly in China, in Thailand, Vietnam, parts of Southeast Asia. Not usually Filipino weapons, that has to be said. Usually Philippine weapons are quite short-hilted. But both Chinese and Japanese swords often have hilts longer than is required for a one-handed sword. Why would this be the case? I would say it's to do with balance, okay? So if you're not going to have a pommel on the end and you don't have a very thick tang, because remember these are usually partial tangs, the tang usually looks like a triangle which comes down and stops about halfway through the grip. About, you know, it go fully through where your lead hand is, but it doesn't usually go down to the end. They're not peened, they're not usually pinned either. Obviously a Japanese sword and Chinese swords are often pinned with a bamboo pin, essentially peg going through, but a makugi, but there's no mass to that. So there's not an awful lot of mass to the tang necessarily, and there's no mass really to the pommel because there isn't a pommel. Even on Chinese swords where it looks like there's a pommel, very often the pommel's completely hollow, so it doesn't have much mass to it. So that being the case, in order to give a certain type of balance, one way you can achieve that is much like when you pick up a stick. Just grab a stick here. Usually, naturally, when people go to swing it, they don't hold it fully by the end. Although they often do in India, I've noticed, which is interesting when you consider Indian swords, but that's a topic for another video. But most people in most parts of the world, when they pick up a stick to swing it, usually hold it about there. because it just feels right. Somehow if you've got the bit projecting out the bottom, it just makes the stick feel that much more nimble because you've got a bit of stick behind your hand. And it's the same thing with these swords. If you held them right at the end, they just feel really, really weird. But if you hold them some way up here, then they feel a lot more nimble and solid in the hand, secure in the hand. Right, so coming to the Siamese Edge replica. Let's put the antique down, 'cause it's actually quite fragile, that, so I have to be a bit careful how I handle it. So some differences between this and antique ones I've noticed is that the fittings, the ferrule and the pommel section up here, and show you in here, seem to be copper alloy. They seem to be metal and relatively solid. Now, of the Dha that I'm familiar with, of the antique ones, sorry, the old traditional ones, these are usually made, if they're made of metal at all, they're usually quite thin sheet metal, so they don't have any mass to them. This feels like it has some solid mass to it. So there's your blade. So it's actually, you'll notice, in overall shape and style, quite similar to my antique example. We've already looked extensively at the scabbard, so let's put that aside for a second. Now, this is a bigger and slightly heavier sword, but it is very, very nicely made, I have to say. So this isn't a full review. It's got distal taper. The finish is very nice. It's got a nice polish on the blade. It's got the maker's mark on one side. Siamese Edge are resellers, so they get traditionally made Dha and other weapons and sell them through their company, so they're resellers. So I don't actually know the maker of this sword, but there is a maker's mark down at the bottom there, or I assume it's a maker's mark, but it could be Siamese Edge's mark. I'm actually not sure. But this is pretty close to the original. I would say overall it is heavier than my antique example, and it is heavier than most of the antique examples I've handled. However, it's not heavy per se. It's still a pretty light and quick and nimble sword that you certainly don't have any impediment and moving around really, really quickly. Traditionally, these would have been used with a shield of varying sizes, a buckler or a shield. However, they were sometimes used by themselves, and they were sometimes used, like in Krabi in pairs, okay? But historically, I suspect in battlefield combat, these were usually used with a shield. So yeah, it handles great, and it's a very interesting sword. One thing I would notice, and this is I guess the one thing the headline I want you to take away from this video, is that I have always had issues with edge alignment with the antique sword there. However, I'd never tried to cut with that sword. It's got an antique ivory grip. It probably wouldn't stand up to any kind of abuse. This sword, however, I can cut with it. I'm going to cut with it when I do the review. But one thing I will say is I have similar issues of edge alignment with this sword having a cylindrical grip. If it was just slightly ovoid, I wouldn't have that issue. But honestly, as you can see at the ferrule, if we look up here, it is completely circular, cylindrical. So honestly, I don't know how I'm going to find this to cut with. If I do more of a slice cut with an edge alignment, still an issue there. Actually, if I throw the point out, I can actually feel the edge alignment a little bit better. And it's certainly a nimble and quick sword, and I wouldn't have any problems, defending myself. It is absolutely, certainly a nimble and quick sword, and I wouldn't have any problems at all sort of, defending or attacking with this in pretty quick time. However, I do often feel like my edge is not really leading, and because it's it's a curved sword, but it's relatively straight, I don't get the weather vane effect of it sort of aligning itself, or the axe effect of it aligning itself and being able to feel where the edge is. And I certainly can't feel it in my hand because the grip's cylindrical. So my question is, if you are experienced with Southeast Asian weapons or Southeast Asian martial arts, how do people using these swords maintain good edge alignment? I honestly don't know. I personally feel that of the Dha design, it is a weakness of the type of sword. However, I need to try this out more. I need to test this more. Do you think I'm going to have problems aligning the edge? Maybe I'll be surprised, and maybe I'll find that it's got enough curve on it that I can feel the edge, and it's just not a problem. I've got to say though, treating it like a stick, I can certainly move it around in the air, certainly quick enough, but I don't feel confident in my edge alignment in doing so. But in the hand, it does move and feel quite similar to me to moving a stick around. It's got a similar sort of, although it's heavier than a stick, well, it's heavier than that stick. It's made of metal, of course, but it does have a similar weight distribution to a stick. It feels quite similar to a stick, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It actually feels quite natural. Anyway, the Burmese Dha, sorry, not the Thai, the Siamese Dha in this case, but you do get them from Burma as well. That example, my antique example, is probably Burmese, and this is made in Thailand. So thanks very much again to Siamese Edge. Check out their link below. If it's a type of sword you're interested in, or you already collect them, check out their website because they're a reseller of them. Very interesting sword. If you know more about how to maintain good edge alignment with them, please let me know, and hopefully that can become useful to me when I do the full review of this sword that it deserves. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you soon. Cheers, folks.